Hello, my name is Ken, and if you've ever wondered about what automobile service stations were like way back in the 1950s and the 1960s, then listen up, because I'm going to talk about them some, and hopefully you will find this very interesting and maybe even educational. And trust me, there is a very big difference between those old automobile service stations from back then as compared to the automobile gas stations that we have today. Way back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and even into the 50s, the old service stations used what was called a Bowser pump, or what some folks called a one-armed Johnny, for dispensing gasoline. And most of those old one-armed Johnnies were mostly all gone by the time I came along. But I still remember when I was a young kid, back in the 1950s, there were still a few independent service stations that still used those old one-armed Johnnies. That was red in color and stood about 7 feet tall. And it had a 10-gallon glass bowl on the top of it, with markings in increments of quarts and gallons. And the service station attendant would use Johnny's arm to manually pump gasoline up into that glass bowl so the customer could see for themselves if there's any water or trash in the gasoline that was being purchased. And if the gasoline looked good, then the attendant would open a valve and let the gasoline gravity flow into the car's gas tank. Those old gasoline Bowser pumps, or one-armed Johnnies, are all gone today and are found mostly in museums. You don't see any of those old automobile service stations anymore because they're all in the history books now. But I'm going to talk about them some so you will know what they were like. And I know what I'm talking about here because I worked at 3 different automobile service stations and 1 truck stop back during my 4 years in high school. Today we have gas stations where people pump their own gasoline and then they pay for it with their credit card right there at the pump, and then they just get back in their car and drive away. But when I was young, there was no such thing as a gas station. There were only automobile service stations, because back many years ago, before the digital age, all gas pumps were strictly mechanical, analog type of gas pumps, and there was just no such thing as a computerized gas pump that would accept a credit card for payment. So the only thing that we had back before the digital age was what was called an automobile service station. And they all had what was called a full service drive-through. And the drive-through area had a small rubber hose on the ground. And when a customer drove their car across that hose, it would ring a bell twice. And that would get our attention and let us know that we have a customer to serve. And then one of the attendants, like me, would trot out there and serve the customer. And the attendant would always have a small red shop rag that would be hanging and dangling out of one of the pockets on the back of his pants. And it was that small red shop rag that we used for wiping off the engine oil dipstick when checking the oil level in the customer's car engine. And that small red shop rag was also used for loosening and unscrewing a very hot cap on the car's radiator when checking the car's coolant level. And for checking the air pressures in the customer's car tires. Every service station attendant carried a car tire air pressure gauge in their shirt pocket. And boy howdy, I still remember how proud I was and how important I felt when I was wearing my green Texaco uniform that had my name over my right front shirt pocket and the large round Texaco star logo patch that was located over my left front shirt pocket. And I still remember too the very popular Texaco motto from back then: you can trust your car to the man who wears the star. And yes, that was me all right. You could definitely trust your car to 16-year-old Kenny. All service stations offered three different octane ratings of gasoline. First, there was regular gasoline, which was the lowest octane rating for the low compression engines, and then there was the premium gasoline, which had a slightly higher octane rating, and then the third was what was called ethyl gasoline, and it was the highest octane rating for the high compression engines that were in the luxury cars like Cadillacs and Lincoln Continentals and whatnot. And that term ethyl was short for tetraethyl lead, because that's what the oil companies used in their gasolines to help boost up the octane ratings, which was very important for high performance engines. And depending on which octane rating was purchased, gasoline cost anywhere from 28 cents per gallon up to about 35 cents per gallon. And back in those days, most common folks never filled up their gas tanks. Those folks usually purchased only $1 or $2 worth of gasoline, and that was it. And even if they didn't have us to fill up their gas tank, they still expected full service, and they got it too. And now, here's what full service consisted of. For one, the customer never had to get out of their car, because we would put the gas in the tank for them, and we would check the engine oil, because back in those days, car engines would use about 1 quart of oil just about every 1,000 to 2,000 miles, and that's if the engine was in good condition. And we would check the water level or coolant in the car's radiator, and we would check the engine's air filter, and we would check the brake fluid reservoir, and we would check the electrolyte level in the car's 6-volt or 12-volt battery. And we would check the air pressure in all 4 tires and their spare tire, and we would clean their windshield with a damp chamois cloth and inspect the rubber windshield wiper blades to see if they needed to be replaced. And we would dump out the car's cigarette ashtray, and we would take a whisk broom and clean out the floorboards, because back then very few cars had carpet. Most cars just had black rubber matting, and that was it. So there you go. That's what was called full service back in those days. And yes, I know, that seems like a lot of work for such a small amount of profit on a gasoline sale. But all that checking everything also created a lot of extra income, because during all of that checking everything, we would very often find other things that needed to be either serviced, repaired, or replaced. And located next to the full service drive-through, every service station had a small wash tub with a small, manually operated, hand crank roller type wringer attached to it. And that's where they would keep several wet chamois cloths for cleaning windshields. Oh, and by the way, it's from those old style roller type clothes wringers that gives us that old saying that is still with us today, and it goes something like this: don't ever let yourself get caught in the wringer. Service stations also repaired flat tires on automobiles, trucks, and farm tractors, and that was back before tubeless tires were invented, when all tires had what was called a rubber inner tube, and we would have to take the inner tube out, find and patch the hole, and then put the inner tube back in the tire, and then put it back on the steel rim again. And boy howdy, I'm going to tell you what, those old 3-piece steel truck rims were extremely dangerous, so you better know what you're doing, and you better follow all of the safety rules, because if you didn't, then you could get killed. To find the hole in the inner tube, we would air up the inner tube to about 5 pounds of pressure, and then we would dump that inner tube into a trough of water and look for the air bubbles. And for repairing a hole in the inner tube, we used 2 different types of patches. There was the gray cold patch, which we called a monkey patch, that was applied over the hole in the inner tube with a contact cement. Or we would sometimes use a red hot patch. That was a vulcanizing method that was applied with an extreme amount of heat, and it would literally melt the red rubber patch over the hole in the black inner tube. Either method of repairing a hole in the inner tube was good, But the coal monkey patch was the quickest and the easiest, so it was used more often than the red hot patch. But some of the old timers would sometimes still insist on using only a hot patch on their inner tube. After we reassembled the tire, the inner tube, and the wheel all back together and aired up the tire to its proper pressure, we would then either spin balance or bubble balance the entire assembly by adding or subtracting lead weights to the steel wheel. Automobiles have not used inner tubes now for many years. Nowadays, automobiles use what's called a tubeless tire. And to fix a flat tire today, the tire shops use what's called a rubber plug that they insert in the hole that's in the tire. And to do that is very quick and it's very simple. And now, here's a term that you never hear anymore. But back when I was a kid, the old timers referred to a tire as a casing. And it didn't matter if it was a car tire, a truck tire, or a farm tractor tire. The old timers referred to tires as a casing. And here's another service that was offered back then. Service stations also washed and waxed cars and pickup trucks. And for working underneath a car, every service station had a hydraulic car lift that would lift up the entire car about 6 feet above the ground. And back in those days, those old cars required an oil and filter change every 3,000 or 4,000 miles, because back then the motor oils were strictly petroleum based and there was no such thing as a long-lasting synthetic oil like we have today. And underneath the car there were 10 or 12 critical points that required fresh grease every 5,000 miles. And the attendant who did all of that kind of work underneath the car at the service station was called the grease monkey. And yeah, that was me, all right, the grease monkey. Service stations also sold kerosene, what some people call coal oil, 25 cents per gallon, because back in those days, many folks still used kerosene burning lamps and lanterns for light. And most folks also used kerosene for burning their trash. And service stations sold 25-pound block ice, because back in those days, many folks still used what was called an ice box. And even to this very day, I still sometimes refer to a refrigerator as an ice box, because old habits are sometimes hard to break. And here is something else that is very interesting. Unlike today, most automobile service stations back in those days did not sell diesel fuel, because there were very few automobiles or pickups that used diesel. So only the truck stops sold diesel fuel. And here is something else that is very interesting that most folks today have never heard of. But back in those days, there was another kind of gasoline that the major oil companies did not sell. And it was called drip gas, DRIP, what some people called white gas, even though it was clear in color. And that old drip gas was an unrefined gasoline that came from an oil well, straight out of the ground. And its natural octane rating was about 60. And some folks would buy it on the black market from farmers and ranchers who would have an oil well on their property. And it could usually be purchased anywhere from 10 cents to 15 cents per gallon. And what made it illegal to use on the roads and highways is the fact that most folks had not paid any road taxes for that drip gasoline. Most of the automobiles that were built in the early 1950s and before had low compression engines, and they could burn that old drip gasoline just fine. But boy howdy, I'm going to tell you what, that old drip gas really smelled horrible. And if you ever got any of it on your clothes, that terrible smell would not wash out. So you had to be really careful when filling your car tank up with drip gas. And service stations also sold and installed new tires, new batteries, new windshield wiper blades, and many other different kinds of automobile accessories. And every service station had a radiator cap tester for testing the customer's radiator cap for proper function. And boy howdy, we sold a lot of new radiator caps. And service stations also stocked and sold all the different kinds of General Electric automotive light bulbs and headlight lamps, both 6-volt and 12-volt, because most cars that were built in 1955 and before used a 6-volt electrical system, and the cars that were built in 1956 and after used the 12-volt electrical systems. And service stations also sold oil and gas treatments and additives that would supposedly make your car run smoother and quieter and make your car engine just purr like a kitten. And some of the brand names of those oil and gas treatments that I still remember are WINS, WYNN''S. And then there was scientific treated petroleum, which most people call STP. And there was a treatment called Shaler Rizlone, and another treatment called Marvel Mystery Oil. And another treatment for the engine was called Motor Honey. And for a leaking radiator, there was a treatment called Bars Leak. And every year, as wintertime was approaching, we would very often flush out the car's radiator and then fill it back up with fresh pressed-on antifreeze. And speaking of those winter times back then, and unlike today, many of those old service stations used an oil-burning heater for heat. And that's when that 100 gallons of used engine oil that we had been saving since spring, summer, and fall would come in real handy. Free heat. And at the front counter, they even sold all of the popular candy bars, including one of my old favorites that you don't see anymore. It was a taffy candy called a Slowpoke, and service stations also sold Lance peanut butter crackers and those Jawbreaker candy balls and Bazooka bubble gum. And a soda pop out of the soda pop machine cost 10 cents, and all the soda pops were in reusable glass bottles. So if you wanted to take the bottle with you, then you had to pay an extra 2 cents. And every service station had a mechanical 5-cent vending machine for purchasing potato chips, Fritos, Cheetos, and one of my old favorites, fried pork skins. And there's something else that you don't see anymore, and those were the Tom Peanuts that came in a small round cardboard tube. And when you opened it, you might even find some money inside, anywhere from a penny to a nickel to a dime, and sometimes even a quarter. And I think every service station on this planet had one of those penny peanut vending machines. And when you put a penny in the slot, it would allow you to turn the crank one time, and then it would put 15 to 20 peanuts into the palm of your hand. And a very popular thing to do back in those days was to take those peanuts and pour them into a bottle of your favorite soda pop. And then you could drink your soda pop and eat your peanuts all at the same time. And back in those days, most everybody smoked cigarettes, and every service station had one of those mechanical, manually operated cigarette vending machines. And for 25 cents, you could buy a 20-count package of your most favorite brand of cigarettes. And many service stations also sold cigars, pipe tobaccos, and chewing tobaccos out of their showcases. And back in those days, many old-timers who were born in the 1800s could not read or write, but they all knew what that carved wooden Indian meant that was standing out front. That meant that that service station sold tobacco products. And here's something else that, thank goodness, you never see anymore. But back in those days, many service stations had a large 1-gallon brass bowl sitting on the floor, and it was called a spittoon. And many of the old-timers who chewed tobacco or dipped snuff would spit their tobacco juice into that spittoon. And the service station employee, who was the lowest in the pecking order, like me, would have to dump out and clean that spittoon. every 3 or 4 days. And oh yeah, that nasty job always fell on the person who was the lowest in the pecking order. And in fact, when I was a young teenage boy working at the automotive service stations, I always thought my real name was Hey You. But boy howdy, I'm going to tell you what, dumping out and cleaning those old spit tunes may sound nasty, but that's only because it really was really nasty. And boy howdy, this younger generation, they better be glad that those old spit tunes are all gone and in the history books now. And just to mention a couple of other things about service stations from back in those days, including the ones where I worked, many service stations would have a light duty tow truck, what some people call a wrecker truck, because there would be many times when we had to go after the customer's disabled car and bring it to the service station for repairs. Many years ago, most all states required an annual safety inspection on the motored vehicles that were registered in their state. And there were many service stations back then that were certified by that state to perform those safety inspections. And for $2, the safety inspector would inspect about 8 different points of interest on your automobile. The safety inspector would inspect the tires, the brakes, the steering system, the engine's exhaust system, the windshield wipers, the rear view mirrors, the headlights, the tail lights, and the stop lights, and even the turn signal lights if the car had turn signal lights, because many of the really old cars did not come from the factory with turn signal lights. So back in those days, most folks used arm signals for turning right or turning left, and the safety inspector would even toot the horn to make sure that works too. And if the car passed all of the safety requirements, the inspector would display a new safety sticker in the left lower corner on the inside of the windshield, and the car would be good to go for another year. And if the car didn't pass the safety inspection, then the owner would have to make the necessary repairs before the car was considered to be safe enough to drive on the road again. And I want to mention here too is the fact that most service stations back in those days offered what was called S&H green stamps. And the number of green stamps that was received was based on the amount of money that was spent on the product or the service. And trust me, the customers loved their S&H green stamps, because after collecting those stamps for a couple of years, they could then go and redeem those stamps at an S&H green stamp store for new products, like a new toaster or a new blender or even a new television and even a new gun and all sorts of other new items. 95% of all payment transactions that occurred at those old automobile service stations was cash only, because back in those days, using a credit card was not as simple as it is today. And besides, only the wealthier people had a credit card. But yes, we did on occasion sometimes accept a credit card that we had to put into a manual credit card machine that used a small piece of cardboard and carbon paper to do the imprint of the credit card's number and the cardholder's name. And then the cardholder had to sign it. And then we had to mail it off at the post office and wait 2 weeks to get paid. And then just keep our fingers crossed and hope that the post office didn't lose it. Back in those days, before the digital age, using a credit card as a method of payment was a very convenient thing to do for a wealthy credit card holder. But for the merchant, it was a whole lot of work for a very small amount of profit. But that's the way it was back in those earlier years, and with the exception of truck stops that were open 24/7, most all service stations were open from 6 a.m. in the morning to 6 p.m. in the evening, Monday through Saturdays, and they were all closed on Sundays. And that's just the way it was. So if you planned to go and visit with Grandma on Sunday, who lived way out of town, then you always had to make sure that your car was filled up with gas and serviced on Saturday the day before. Things are much different today than they were back then, because back in those earlier years, before there was any such thing as a drive-through fast food restaurant, and before the interstate system and rest areas were built in the early 1960s, traveling motorists depended very heavily on the Ma and Pa cafes and the automobile service stations that were mostly located in the small towns that were there on their way to their destinations. And that's just the way it was back then. There have been a few times when I have opened up the service station at 6 a.m. in the morning, and there would be a sleeping traveling motorist who would be parked in our drive-through waiting for our service station to open up so they could buy some gas and continue on their trip. Back in the 1960s and before, and during the hot summer times, many folks did their traveling at night time when the air was much cooler, because back in those days, very few cars had air conditioning, and only the more expensive luxury cars had air conditioning back then. The 1960s was the decade of the muscle cars. And boy howdy, I'm going to tell you what, those old muscle cars had two things that really stood out: character and horsepower. And starting from a dead standstill, those old muscle cars could flat out run through a quarter-mile race in 14 to 15 seconds flat. And the service stations just loved those old muscle cars, because with their big bored V8 engines and their big barreled carburetors, they also flat out guzzled down the gasoline. And with all that said, let me say just one more thing about working at the automobile service stations back in the 1950s and the 1960s. It was very hard and dirty work, and sometimes very dangerous work, and it was very long hours with little bitty tiny pay. So there you go. Now you know what an automobile service station was like way back in the 1950s and 60s. And thank you very much for walking down memory lane with me. And if you're one of the old timers like I am, and you have noticed something that I missed, then please send me a comment and let me know about it so it can be shared with other folks so they'll know about it too. And I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed watching and listening to all of this as much as I have enjoyed making it. And I sincerely hope that if you did enjoy it, then you will click on that thumbs up like button. Thank you very much, and goodbye.